"You're not my wife anymore, Claire." "Not really. You're just the person who takes care of my mother." He said it standing in the kitchen doorway at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, keys already in his hand, like he was late for something that mattered more than this conversation. "My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 44 years old, and for 16 years of marriage, I believed I understood exactly what I was to Daniel. Standing there in my own kitchen, dish towel still in my hand, I understood I had been wrong. I'm a physical therapist. I spend my working days teaching other people's bodies how to trust themselves again, after a stroke, a fall, a surgery that took something from them they didn't know they could lose. I am good at patience. I am good at watching for small signs of improvement in people who don't believe improvement is coming. I did not expect, at 44, to need every one of those skills inside my own marriage, in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the dinner nobody but Eleanor and I had eaten that night." He didn't wait for an answer. He left. The door closed quietly, the way it closed every night now, not a slam, nothing dramatic, just a soft click that somehow said more than shouting would have. 16 years earlier, when Daniel and I met, it had looked like love from every angle anyone cared to check. We married in a backyard in June, under string lights his college roommate had strung crookedly between two maples, and for a long time, most of those 16 years, honestly, it was love, or close enough to it that I never thought to measure the distance. He remembered how I took my coffee. I remembered the exact tone of voice his mother used when she was disappointed in him, and I softened it before it reached him. We built a life the way most people do, in small, unremarkable increments. A house in Boise with a porch that caught the evening sun, a daughter named Maya who arrived 9 years in and rearranged both of our definitions of tired, a rhythm to our days that felt, most of the time, like something solid. I wasn't naive about the friction underneath it. No marriage is only the good parts. Daniel worked long hours running his father's old construction company, and there were years, especially after his father died, when he came home so wrung out he barely spoke through dinner. I told myself that was just who he was under stress, quiet, retreating, needing space before he could be present again. I believed in us more than the evidence always strictly supported. I don't think that made me naive. I think it made me hopeful. Even now, I'm not sure those are different things. 14 months before that night in the kitchen, Daniel's mother Eleanor had a stroke in her kitchen up in McCall and lay on the floor for 6 hours before a neighbor noticed her car hadn't moved and let herself in with the spare key. Eleanor survived, but her right side didn't come all the way back with her, and neither did her patience. Daniel informed me really, over breakfast one morning with the decision already made that she would move in with us instead of into assisted living. "It's temporary," he said. "Just until we figure out the long-term plan." I remember nodding. I remember thinking, of course. This is what family does. That was the beginning of the year that unmade something in our marriage so slowly I didn't feel it happening until it was mostly gone. Eleanor arrived with a hospital bed for the sunroom, a walker with tennis balls on the feet, and 6 prescription bottles that lined up on our kitchen counter like a small, watchful army. I didn't resent her, I want to say that clearly, because of what comes later, and because it would be easy to assume otherwise. Eleanor, even diminished, was sharp-eyed and often funny in a dry way that caught me off guard, and some mornings, helping her into her chair by the window, I felt something close to tenderness that surprised me. What I resented, though it took me months to let myself use that word even privately, was the way Daniel handled her care exactly the way he handled every uncomfortable thing in our marriage, by handing it to me and calling it teamwork. "You're so good with her," he told me early on, watching me help Eleanor into the shower chair, watching me learn to read the half-formed words her stroke had left behind faster than her speech therapist could chart them. For the first few months, it sounded like a compliment. Somewhere around month 8, I understood it wasn't one. It was a job description he'd written for me without asking whether I wanted the position, or whether I had room in my life for it alongside my patients, our daughter, and whatever remained of being his wife. I told myself it was temporary stress. I told myself men disappear into work when they're afraid, and that this was simply Daniel being Daniel under pressure I couldn't fully understand, because it wasn't my mother on that kitchen floor for 6 hours. Our daughter Maya, 15 that year, started eating dinner upstairs in her room more nights than not. "It's too quiet down there," she told me once, not unkindly, just honestly, the way teenagers sometimes hand you the truth without meaning to wound you with it. She wasn't wrong. Somewhere in those months, Daniel had quietly stopped coming home for dinner most nights. Job site ran long. Grabbing something with the crew before I head back. The explanations never changed, and after a while, I stopped asking which crew, because some part of me had already decided I didn't want to know the answer. There is a moment I keep returning to, even now, when I try to locate exactly where things started to slip. It was a Tuesday in March, unremarkable in every way except one. Eleanor had a physical therapy appointment that afternoon, and I'd taken the day off to drive her, which meant I was home alone doing laundry when I found a receipt folded into the inside pocket of Daniel's work jacket. A restaurant 40 minutes north of the city, the kind of place you don't drive to for a solo lunch between job sites. 2 entrees listed. A bottle of wine. I stood in the laundry room holding that receipt for what felt like a very long time. The dryer hummed behind me. Somewhere down the hall, Eleanor's television murmured through the wall in the particular cadence of an afternoon game show. And I made a decision in that moment that I still can't fully explain to myself, except to say that some part of me understood, instinctively, that once I asked the question the receipt was raising, I would not be able to unknow the answer. I folded the jacket. I put the receipt back exactly where I'd found it. I never mentioned it. I want to stop here for just a second. If you've ever held proof of something in your hands and chosen, instead, to keep folding the laundry, to keep making dinner for someone who might not come home to eat it, you already understand why I didn't say anything that day. It wasn't strength. It wasn't even real denial. It was fear wearing the costume of patience, and I wore it well. I told myself I was imagining a pattern that wasn't there. I told myself a lot of things that spring, and most of them had the specific gravity of statements I needed to be true rather than ones I actually believed. What I did not imagine, a few weeks later, was a phone call from Daniel's sister Renee. Her voice had a careful quality to it that put me on guard before she'd said more than my name. "Has Danny said anything to you," she asked, "about Mom's house up in McCall? About maybe selling it?" I told her no, he hadn't mentioned anything like that. There was a pause on the line, just a beat too long to be nothing. "Okay," Renee said finally. "Never mind. Probably nothing." The way she said nothing made it very clear she meant the opposite. I didn't think about that call again for almost 3 weeks. I wish I could say I chased it down immediately, that I was the kind of woman who pulls a thread the moment it appears loose. I wasn't. I let it go the way I let most things go that year filed under later, which had quietly become the place I put everything I was afraid to look at directly. By early summer, Eleanor had improved enough physically that Daniel arranged, presented to me as a generous gesture, though I noticed the scheduling almost immediately for a home health aide to come 3 afternoons a week, giving me what he called a break. Her name was Sophie. 34, warm, quick to laugh in a way that filled our quiet house with a sound it had been missing. Eleanor liked her instantly, in a way I hadn't managed to earn from her in months of careful, patient care. I liked Sophie too. I want that on the record, because it matters later, and because it would be easy, too easy, to cast her as something she wasn't. It was Sophie, folding towels beside me in the laundry room on an ordinary Thursday, who said the thing that lodged itself somewhere under my ribs and refused to come loose. "Daniel mentioned you two might be moving soon," she said, not looking up from the towel she was folding, entirely unaware she was handing me something heavier than either of us understood in that moment. Something about downsizing, once things settle with Eleanor? I told her I hadn't heard anything about moving. Sophie's expression did something small and apologetic, the look of someone realizing, a half-second too late, that they'd said more than they were meant to. She changed the subject quickly, asked something about Eleanor's afternoon medication schedule, and I answered on autopilot while a low, cold current moved through my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I didn't ask Daniel about it that night. I told myself I'd bring it up when the time felt right. There was never a right time. There never is, when part of you already suspects what the answer will cost. That was the same night, hours later, after Sophie had gone home and Eleanor had been settled with her nighttime medications and the house had gone quiet in the particular way it did after 10 o'clock. That Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway with his keys already in his hand and told me, without any preamble at all, what I think some part of me had already begun to suspect he believed. You're not my wife anymore. You're just the person who takes care of my mother. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark listening to the faint mechanical hum of Eleanor's oxygen concentrator through the wall, and I thought about a receipt I'd folded back into a jacket pocket and never mentioned. I thought about Renee's careful voice asking about a house in McCall. I thought about Sophie's apologetic face in the laundry room, the word downsizing sitting there between the towels like something she hadn't meant to hand me. For the first time, lying awake in a bed that suddenly felt too large, I let myself consider the possibility that these were not three separate, unrelated things. That somewhere underneath the daily choreography of medications and physical therapy schedules and dinners eaten alone, something had been assembling itself without my permission, something with a shape I hadn't yet let myself see clearly. Because seeing it clearly meant I would have to do something about it. I got up sometime after 1 in the morning and stood in the hallway outside the linen closet, my hand resting on the door for a long moment without opening it. I don't know what instinct stopped me that night. Maybe it was simply exhaustion, or maybe some part of me understood I wasn't ready yet for whatever was waiting behind that door. I went back to bed without opening it. I didn't know it yet, but 11 days later, reaching for a fresh set of pillowcases in that same closet, I would find something that wouldn't just answer the questions I'd been avoiding all spring. It would answer questions I hadn't even known yet that I needed to ask. 11 days is a long time to live beside a feeling you haven't found a name for yet. I went back to my routine, because routine was the only structure I had left that still made sense. Eleanor's morning medications lined up and administered in the correct order. Her stretching exercises on the sunroom floor, where the light was best for her mood even on days her mood resisted improving. The low murmur of the daytime television she claimed not to actually watch while watching every episode. I was good at this. Being good at it was the one part of my life that hadn't started to feel like a performance. I did not go back to trusting the quiet in my own house. Daniel's behavior in those 11 days had a texture I hadn't let myself notice before, or had noticed and quietly filed under things that didn't matter. He started taking his phone into the bathroom when it rang, something he'd never done in 16 years. Small thing. Easy to dismiss. He started keeping his truck keys in his pocket instead of on the hook by the door where they'd hung since we moved in, also small, also easy to explain away as a habit shift, a man getting older and more forgetful about where he set things down. Once, over coffee, I told myself, casually, whether he'd heard anything more from Renee about his mother's house. He answered too fast. No, nothing. Why would she call you about that? Not did she call. Why would she call? As if the wrong version of the question had already occurred to him before I'd finished asking mine. It wasn't what he said. It was the shape of it, the way a guilty man answers a question that hasn't been asked yet. Maya noticed things too, in the particular way 15-year-olds notice things without being able to name them. She started asking, almost too casually, whether Dad was going to make it to her recital next month. Whether he was working a lot lately. Whether Grandma was staying with us, forever now, a question she asked while looking at her plate instead of at me. I told her I didn't know. It was the truest thing I said to anyone in that house for weeks. Eleanor watched me with an attentiveness that took me a while to place. She'd lost words to the stroke, not instincts, and there were mornings I caught her studying my face while I adjusted her pillows, like she was deciding whether to hand me something she was carrying. Once, she reached out with her good hand, the left one, slow and deliberate the way everything about her had become slow and deliberate, and covered my hand where it rested on the blanket. She didn't say anything. She just held it there a beat too long to mean nothing. I've thought about that moment more than almost anything else from that spring. I still don't know exactly what she was trying to tell me. I only know that she was trying. I want to be honest about something here, because the story doesn't work if I pretend I handled that stretch of time well. I started snapping at Maya over things that didn't deserve it: a forgotten dish in the sink, a door left unlocked. I let 2 calls from my sister go to voicemail because I didn't have the energy to sound like myself. I told my closest friend, Priya, when she asked how I was doing, that I was fine, just tired, which was the sentence I'd use for the next several weeks every time someone got close enough to ask a real question. Looking back, that was its own kind of lie, not to them, but to myself, dressed up as consideration for people who might have actually helped if I'd let them. Sleep didn't come easily that stretch. I'd lie awake past midnight listening to the tick of Eleanor's oxygen machine through the wall, and some nights my chest would go tight for no reason I could point to, just a fist closing slowly somewhere under my sternum, gone by morning. Easy to blame on caffeine or worry about Maya's upcoming exams. I didn't connect it, not then, to anything specific. I just noticed, the way you notice weather, that something in my body had started bracing for an impact it couldn't see coming yet. It was a Thursday in late June, hot enough that the box fan in the hall closet had been running for a week to keep the linens from carrying the faint cedar smell of the old chest Eleanor's things had come from. A smell none of us had gotten around to airing out properly. I was reaching past a stack of extra pillowcases for fresh sheets for Eleanor's bed when my hand caught on something that didn't belong there. A manila folder wedged flat against the shelf's back panel, in the specific way you place something you don't want found by accident. Except accidents happen anyway. Inside were documents from a law office downtown, the letterhead crisp and unfamiliar. Divorce filing paperwork. Daniel's signature at the bottom, dated 7 weeks earlier, notarized. My name listed as respondent, spelled correctly, which somehow felt like its own small cruelty. He hadn't even needed to think about how to spell it. And clipped to the front page, a handwritten note in Daniel's block capitals, the same handwriting he used for job estimates. Wait until after Mom's trust transfers, don't file yet. I sat down on the hallway floor. I don't remember deciding to sit, my legs simply stopped being useful to me, the exact way I'd watched happen to 100 patients over the years, the body understanding something before the mind finishes catching up to it. Even now, when I think about that folder, I feel it first in my hands, the particular weight of paper you were never supposed to hold. 7 weeks. He had known for 7 weeks. Had it drafted, reviewed, notarized, and every single one of those 49 days, he'd come home some nights and let me hand him a plate. Let me tell him about Eleanor's physical therapy progress like it was still information he had a stake in. Let me fall asleep beside him like there was still a marriage occurring in that bed instead of a countdown he'd already started without me. I read the note again. Wait until after Mom's trust transfers. Not wait until I'm sure. Not wait until we've tried counseling or talked or given this a real chance. Wait until the money was settled. The timing wasn't incidental. The timing was the entire plan. I sat there long enough that my legs went numb against the hallway floor, long enough that Eleanor's television clicked over to a new program down the hall, its rhythm unbroken by anything happening 20 feet away in a linen closet doorway. I thought about calling Renee right then. I thought about calling Priya. I thought, briefly and with a clarity that frightened me, about simply walking into the sunroom and reading the note aloud to Eleanor, letting her see exactly what her son had written about her trust like it was a business milestone. I did none of those things. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, wedged flat against the shelf's back panel, the pillowcases res-tacked in the same order. I told myself I needed time to think before I did anything with what I now knew. What I understand now, months later, is that this was the moment my particular flaw took the wheel most fully, the part of me that needed to be the one holding everything together, even the thing that was actively working to destroy me. Some instinct in me decided, without consulting the rest of me, that whatever came next needed me steady first, composed first, useful first, as if steadiness were still a currency that would buy me anything in this marriage. That evening, I made dinner as if nothing had changed. Chicken, the roasted vegetables Eleanor could manage with her weaker side, rice for Maya because she'd stopped eating anything Eleanor's diet required. Daniel came home at 7:30, later than usual, smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't recognize and didn't ask about. He kissed the top of my head on his way past me to the sink, an absent, habitual gesture, the kind you do for someone you've stopped truly seeing. I let him. I want to stop here, just for a second. If you've ever kept moving through an ordinary evening, dinner, dishes, a goodnight kiss, while carrying something that had already changed everything, you know exactly what that particular kind of exhaustion feels like. It isn't acting. It's survival wearing acting's clothes. I didn't tell Renee what I'd found, though I thought about calling her back more than once that week, thought about finally asking her directly what she'd really meant about the house in McCall. I didn't tell Sophie, though she asked me gently, on Friday, whether everything was all right. She said I looked tired in a way that wasn't just tired. I told her yes, fine, just a long week. I told no one. That silence was, I understand now, both the only thing keeping me upright that week and the exact thing that let Daniel keep believing he had more time than he actually did. 3 days after I found the folder, something small happened that I almost missed entirely, buried as it was under everything else occupying my attention. I was helping Eleanor with her afternoon exercises, slow arm raises, her left hand steadying the right, when she stopped mid-motion, looked at me with an intensity that made me pause, and said, haltingly, in the effortful, rebuilding speech that had become hers since the stroke, "Don't let him make you small." I laughed it off gently, the way you do with someone whose thoughts sometimes arrive slightly sideways since a stroke. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor," I told her and helped her finish the set. She shook her head, frustrated at her own words, at the gap between what she meant and what her mouth could deliver. "No," she said. "Listen. Small." I didn't understand what she meant that day. I told myself it was the stroke talking, the way thoughts sometimes crossed wires on their way out of her. It would be another 2 weeks before I understood she'd been trying, in the only words she could reach, to tell me something she already knew. The following Monday, I noticed Daniel had started a new habit, checking his phone the moment he woke up, before coffee, before even fully opening his eyes, thumb already moving across the screen in the gray pre-dawn light. He'd never been a morning phone person. He used to say mornings were for coffee and quiet, that the world's demands could wait until he'd had both. Now the phone came first, every day, and he'd angle the screen slightly away from me on the nightstand, a small unconscious adjustment I doubt he was even aware he was making. I noticed. I filed it. I didn't ask. There's a version of that spring where I ask every single question the moment it occurs to me, and I don't know what that version of me finds, or when, or whether it changes anything at all. I only know the version of me that actually lived through it, kept choosing later, again and again, until later ran out on its own. Work, at least, remained a place I could still trust. My patience didn't require me to guess at what they weren't saying. A knee that wouldn't bear weight told me exactly what it needed. No interpretation required, no folder hidden behind pillowcases. I found myself staying later at the clinic that month, not because there was more work, but because the clinic was the one room in my life that hadn't started to feel like a held breath. It was there, on a Wednesday afternoon between patients, that Priya finally cornered me in the break room and refused to accept fine, just tired as an answer. She'd known me since physical therapy school, 20 years of watching me underreport my own distress with the same clinical detachment I brought to charting someone else's. "Claire," she said, not unkindly, "you've lost weight you didn't need to lose, and you jumped like I'd shot you when I touched your arm just now. Something is happening at home. You don't have to tell me what. But don't tell me it's nothing." I didn't tell her about the folder. I wasn't ready. I don't think I even had language for it yet. Not really. Not the kind of language that makes a thing real by saying it out loud to someone who would believe me instantly and completely. But I told her something had shifted with Daniel. That I didn't trust the shape of our house lately. She held my hand across the break room table for a moment, said nothing more than, "I'm here when you're ready," and let me go back to my 3 o'clock without pushing further. Looking back, that was the first crack in the silence I'd built around myself. I didn't recognize it as one at the time. I thought I was simply having a hard week. That Thursday evening, Daniel came home early for the first time in longer than I could immediately remember, and something about his energy was different, lighter, almost, in a way that should have comforted me and instead made the fine hair on my arms rise without my understanding why. He helped clear the dinner table. He asked Maya about her recital piece with what looked like genuine interest. He caught my eye once across the kitchen and smiled in a way that, 16 years ago, would have meant something entirely different than what I now suspected it meant. Later that night, after Eleanor was settled and Maya had gone up to her room, Daniel found me in the kitchen finishing the last of the dishes and said, without any particular weight in his voice, like it was a passing thought rather than something he'd clearly been building toward, "I've been thinking. Once Mom's more settled, really settled, medically, maybe we should think about what's next. For all of us." I asked him what he meant by next. He didn't quite answer. He said something vague about options and not being stuck in one version of things forever, and then his phone buzzed on the counter, and he glanced at it with an expression that closed like a door before I could read anything on his face. And he said he needed to take the call, and he stepped out onto the back porch with it, out of earshot, the sliding door clicking shut behind him with a precision that felt, for the first time, entirely deliberate. I stood in the kitchen with a dish towel in my hands and understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof and everything to do with 16 years of learning this man's rhythms, that whatever he was building toward had already started moving without me, on a schedule I hadn't been given, toward a version of next that did not, in any way I could see, include me standing in this kitchen at all. I didn't confront him that night. I told myself, again, that I needed more than a hidden folder and a strange phrase and a phone angled away from me on a nightstand. I told myself I needed to be certain before I said anything I couldn't take back. I didn't know it yet, but the thing that would finally make me certain wasn't going to come from anything Daniel said. It was going to come from his mother, from 3 words, spoken haltingly, that I hadn't understood the first time she'd said them, and that I would understand completely the second time, in a moment I never saw coming. The moment came on a Sunday, 3 weeks after I'd found the folder, in the sunroom where Eleanor spent most of her afternoons watching the light move across the yard. I want to say I'd stopped thinking about the divorce papers by then, but that wouldn't be true. I thought about them constantly in the gaps between patients at the clinic, in the half-second before sleep took me, in the particular silence that fell over the kitchen whenever Daniel walked in, and I found myself studying his face for something I couldn't name. What had changed in those 3 weeks was that the fear had started curdling into something else. Not yet anger. Something quieter and more clear-eyed than anger. A kind of watching. Eleanor had been having a harder week. Her speech therapist mentioned a small setback, nothing alarming, just the kind of plateau that sometimes comes after steady progress, her body needing to consolidate before it could push forward again. She was tired in a way that made her more honest, the way exhaustion sometimes strips the careful filters people build around difficult truths. I was helping her with her afternoon medications, sorting the small paper cup of pills, when she reached over with her good hand and gripped my wrist. Not gently this time. Hard enough that I looked up from the pill organizer, startled. "Claire," she said, my name coming out clean, the first time in weeks she'd managed it without the stroke's usual drag on the consonants. "Listen to me now. Before I lose it again." I set the pill cup down. Something in her tone had reorganized the entire room around it. "Danny," she said, slow and deliberate, fighting for each word the way she fought for all of them now, he asked me. "About the house. In McCall. Wants me to sign it. Sell it." Before, she stopped, frustrated, her hand tightening further on my wrist. "Before the trust. Before it goes to you. To Maya." I felt the floor of the room shift very slightly, though nothing in the room had actually moved. "What trust, Eleanor?" She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her since before the stroke, clear, sharp, entirely present. "My trust," she said. "For Maya. For you some. Danny doesn't know I changed it. After the stroke. My lawyer came. Danny doesn't know. I want to stop here, just for a second, because I don't think I've ever fully explained to anyone what it feels like to have the ground of your own life redrawn by someone you'd stopped expecting anything from. If you've ever had someone the world had written off surprise you completely, actually see you, actually choose you, you know exactly what that moment did to me." She went on, piecing the sentences together with visible effort, and what emerged, slowly, over the next 20 minutes, reframed everything I thought I understood about the year that had just passed. After her stroke, while still in the hospital, Eleanor had quietly revised her estate plan. Not the version everyone assumed was in place, the one Daniel had grown up believing would eventually be his outright, but a new trust that split her assets differently, with meaningful provisions carved out specifically for Maya's education and, in a clause she seemed almost embarrassed to mention for me. She hadn't told Daniel. She'd told her lawyer to hold the change quietly, hadn't decided yet how or when to tell her son, and had been watching, these past months, from her hospital bed in our sunroom, with more clarity than any of us had given her credit for. The exact way Daniel had begun treating both his mother and his wife as instruments in a plan that no longer matched reality. He thinks, Eleanor said, the house money. His, once trust settles. He doesn't know. She struggled for the word, found it. Redirected. I sat very still, holding a half-sorted cup of pills, absorbing the fact that for months, while I'd believed myself the only person in this house carrying a secret, Eleanor had been carrying one of her own, one that, whether she'd fully intended it or not, was going to detonate directly underneath the plan I'd found notarized behind a stack of pillowcases. Does Renee know? I asked. Eleanor's face changed, something careful moving across it. Renee helped, she said. Found the lawyer. So that was what the phone call in April had really been. Not idle curiosity about a house in McCall. Renee had known, had helped Eleanor rewrite the entire foundation Daniel believed he was standing on, and had called me, in her own careful, indirect way, trying to feel out whether I already understood what was coming. I didn't sleep well that night either, but it was a different kind of wakefulness than the one that had followed finding the folder, less dread, more a strange, unsteady vigilance. Like standing at the edge of something about to move without knowing which direction the movement would take. I want to be honest about the days that followed, because they were not my best. I became distracted at work in a way that wasn't like me. I double-booked 2 patients on a Thursday, something I hadn't done in 12 years of practice, and had to apologize to a man recovering from hip surgery who'd waited 40 minutes past his appointment time while I stared at Eleanor's chart instead of his. Priya covered for me without asking questions, which told me she'd already decided something was seriously wrong and was choosing, for now, to let me come to her on my own timeline. At home, I started watching Daniel the way I watch a patient's gait, cataloging small deviations from baseline without yet understanding what they meant. He'd started coming home even later some nights, and on the nights he was home, he was oddly, unfamiliarly attentive, asking about my day with a specificity he hadn't bothered with in over a year, complimenting a meal I hadn't put any particular effort into, touching my shoulder and passing in a way that felt less like affection and more like a man checking that a fixture was still bolted where he'd left it. Behavioral commentary, because I've thought about this more than almost anything else. I didn't ask him directly what he knew, or thought he knew, about his mother's trust. Not because I lacked the nerve exactly. I think some part of me was still gathering, still building toward a moment I could survive, rather than one that would simply happen to me the way the kitchen conversation had happened to me. It was during this stretch that the second of the 2 moments I'd later understand as turning points arrived, though at the time it seemed almost incidental. I was in the garage looking for a box of Maya's old winter clothes when I found, tucked into a filing box Daniel used for the business, a folder of bank statements from an account I didn't recognize, not one of ours. Not one I'd ever seen on any joint document in 16 years of marriage. A savings account, opened 11 months earlier, right around the time Eleanor moved in with us, with automatic transfers coming in from Daniel's business account every 2 weeks. The balance, as of the most recent statement, sat just over $41,000. I stood in the garage holding those statements the same way I'd sat on the hallway floor holding the divorce papers, my body understanding the shape of what I was looking at before my mind had finished assembling the words for it. This wasn't emergency savings. This wasn't a surprise vacation fund. This was money being quietly, systematically moved somewhere Daniel didn't want me to see it, on a timeline that lined up almost exactly with Eleanor's stroke, with the divorce filing, with all of it. Looking back now, I think that account was never really about the money itself, not entirely. I think it was about control. About Daniel needing somewhere in his life that was entirely his, unshared, unaccounted for, at exactly the moment everything else, his mother's health, his mother's trust, his own marriage, had started to feel like it was slipping past what he could manage. I didn't understand that yet, standing in the garage. I only understood that the ground under me had shifted a second time in 1 month, and I was running out of places to stand. I photographed every page of those statements with my phone, my hands not quite steady, and put the folder back exactly where I'd found it, the same instinct that had governed the divorce papers. The same careful preservation of a secret I wasn't yet ready to spend. I didn't tell Eleanor about the account. I didn't tell Renee. I told myself, again, that I needed to be sure of what the money meant, sure of what I would do once I knew, before I said a word to anyone. I understand now that being sure had become less a genuine strategy and more a way of postponing a moment I was afraid I wouldn't survive intact. That evening, Daniel came home unusually early again, and this time he brought flowers, not a gesture that fit anywhere in the pattern of our marriage, not in years, and set them on the counter with a small, strange smile that didn't reach the rest of his face. "Been thinking we haven't had a real date night in a while," he said. "Once things settle with Mom, we should." I thanked him for the flowers. I put them in water. I did not ask him what, exactly, he thought was going to settle, or when, or what he imagined settling would look like once it happened, because I already had 2 folders worth of evidence suggesting he had a very specific, very detailed version of that answer already in motion, and none of it, as far as I could tell, involved me standing in this kitchen watching him bring home flowers I hadn't earned and he hadn't meant. I said thank you. I meant something closer to "I see you now." All the way through. It was Maya, oddly, who gave me the peace I hadn't known I needed. A week after the flowers, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, she came downstairs from her room while I was folding laundry, the laundry room again, always the laundry room, and sat on the dryer the way she used to when she was small, swinging her legs, working up to something. "Mom," she said, "is Dad seeing someone?" I stopped folding. "Why would you ask that?" She shrugged, not quite meeting my eyes. "I saw a text on his phone when he left it on the counter. It said something like, 'Can't wait for this to be over so we can actually be together.'" I didn't mean to read it. It was just there. A 15-year-old, reading a phone left carelessly on a counter, handed me in one sentence what 2 hidden folders and a garage full of bank statements had been circling for a month. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, whether she'd seen who the message was from. She said no, just a name, S, no last name, the contact saved with a single letter the way people save numbers they don't want anyone else recognizing. S. I thought of Sophie immediately, and then, just as immediately, felt sick at myself for thinking it Sophie, who folded towels beside me, who made Eleanor laugh, who'd handed me the word downsizing months earlier with an apologetic face that had seemed, at the time, entirely without guile. I didn't know, that night, whether the S was Sophie or someone else entirely, someone I hadn't even met, some other name folded into a life I was only now beginning to see the true shape of. I want to stop here and be honest about something. Part of me, a part I'm not proud of, wanted, in that moment, for it not to be Sophie. Not because it would have made the betrayal worse, exactly, but because Sophie had been kind to Eleanor, kind to me, and some old habit of mine still wanted to protect the people around me from the consequences of a mess I hadn't made. I hugged Maya and told her she'd done the right thing telling me, and that I would handle it, and that none of it, was anything she needed to carry. She held on to me a beat longer than usual before she went back upstairs, and I stood alone in the laundry room afterward with my hands braced on the dryer, breathing in a way that took real, deliberate effort. The tightness in my chest, the same one I'd been ignoring for weeks, finally arriving in full. I didn't confront Daniel that night. I told myself, one more time, that I wasn't ready, that I needed the full picture before I said anything I couldn't take back. I didn't know it yet, but I was closer to that full picture than I understood. And the person who would finally hand me the last piece of it wasn't going to be Eleanor, or Renee, or Maya. It was going to be Sophie herself, and not in the way I expected at all. Sophie called me herself 2 days later, before I'd found any way to raise the subject, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Claire, can we talk? Not about Eleanor. About something else. I met her in the clinic parking lot on my lunch break, away from the house, away from anyone who might overhear. She sat in her car with the window down, twisting the strap of her bag in her hands before she finally looked at me directly. I think you should know something, she said. Daniel asked me last week if I'd consider a private arrangement, caring for Eleanor full-time, off the books, once things changed at your house. He said it like it was already decided. Like you weren't going to be part of the picture anymore. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly and something else tighten in its place. Did he say why? He implied you two were separating. He asked me not to mention it to you yet. She looked down at her hands. I should have told you the day he asked. I didn't, because I needed the job, and I told myself it wasn't my business. It was cowardly. I'm sorry. So the S in Maya's phone hadn't been Sophie after all. That realization landed with a strange, complicated relief that unraveled almost immediately into a colder question. If not Sophie, then who? I thanked her for telling me now and meant it, though it would be a lie to say the relief fully erased the sting of her silence. She'd known. For a week, she'd carried the knowledge that my marriage was ending on a timeline I hadn't been given, and she'd said nothing until her own conscience outweighed her caution. I understood why. I didn't entirely forgive it, not yet. But I filed it, one more piece in a picture that kept resolving into sharper focus every time I thought I'd finally seen the whole of it. I didn't ask her outright who S might be. Some instinct told me the answer would come from somewhere else, and it did 3 days later, in a way I hadn't anticipated at all. Renee called that Friday, and this time there was no careful indirection in her voice at all. Claire, I need to tell you something, and I should have told you months ago. I'm sorry I didn't. She told me about a woman named Stacy Merton, a client relations coordinator at Daniel's company, hired 18 months earlier, around the same time. Renee now realized with the particular clarity of hindsight that Daniel's hours had started stretching later and later. Renee had seen them together at a fundraiser back in April, standing closer than colleagues stand, and had said nothing at the time because she wasn't certain and didn't want to blow up my marriage over something that might have been nothing. But it wasn't nothing, Renee said now. I found out last week. From someone at the company. It's been going on for months, Claire. I'm so sorry I sat on it. Stacy. Not Sophie. A name I'd never once heard spoken in our house, attached to a woman I'd never met, who had apparently been present at the edges of my marriage for 1.5 years while I adjusted Eleanor's pillows and told myself Daniel's absences were about grief and stress and a company that demanded too much of him. I asked Renee carefully whether she'd known about the divorce filing. She hadn't. That much, at least, seemed to be new information to her, and her silence on the line afterward had the particular weight of someone recalculating everything she thought she understood about her brother. There's something else, she said finally. The reason I called about the McCall house back in April, I wasn't just fishing for information. Danny asked me to help him convince Mom to sell it before the trust settled. He told me it was so there'd be, his words, less complication when things changed with you. I told him no. That's actually part of why I helped Mom find her own lawyer. I didn't like what he was planning, even before I fully understood what he was planning. So Renee hadn't simply been a passive witness to all of this. She'd been quietly working against her brother's plan for months, in her own careful way, long before I'd found a folder wedged behind pillowcases. I thought of the silent ally I'd sensed in Eleanor's grip on my wrist, in Renee's guarded phone calls, and understood, finally, that I hadn't been as alone in this as I'd believed all spring. I hung up the phone that afternoon and sat in my car in the clinic parking lot for a long time before I could make myself go back inside for my 3 o'clock appointment. Everything I'd gathered over the past month arranged itself, finally, into something that resembled a complete shape rather than scattered, disconnected pieces. The notarized divorce papers waiting on a trust transfer. The hidden savings account, $41,000 and climbing. A woman named Stacy who had apparently been present in my marriage's blind spot for 18 months. Eleanor's quietly rewritten trust, protecting Maya and me from a plan Daniel didn't even know existed. Renee working against her brother in small, careful ways I hadn't recognized as allegiance until just now. I want to stop here for a moment, because I think this was the point where something in me stopped being afraid and started, instead, becoming very calm. Not the calm of someone who has made peace with what's happening. The calm of someone who has finally stopped waiting for someone else to tell her what she already knows. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in the months since finding the folder. I went back to the linen closet, pulled the divorce papers out one more time, and photographed every page, the filing, the notarization, the handwritten note about waiting on the trust transfer, with the same careful attention I'd given the bank statements weeks before. I combined them, that night, into a single folder on my laptop alongside screenshots of the account statements and the message Maya had glimpsed, along with dates, times. A timeline I built out methodically the way I'd build a treatment plan for a patient whose recovery depended on getting the sequence exactly right. I told no one I had done this. Not Priya, not Renee, not Eleanor. I put the physical folder back exactly where I'd found it, wedged flat against the shelf's back panel, and said nothing to Daniel that weekend beyond the ordinary logistics of a marriage still performing itself, Eleanor's medication schedule, Maya's recital rehearsal, whether we needed milk. This is the part I've thought hardest about since, the part I'm least sure I'd repeat if given the choice again. I had, by that Sunday night, everything I needed to end this on my own terms, clear evidence, a timeline, a story that couldn't be argued away. And I said nothing. I held it. Not because I was afraid anymore, not exactly. Because some old, stubborn part of me still wanted to choose the moment myself, rather than have it forced out of me a second time in a kitchen doorway. Daniel, in the days that followed, seemed to sense some shift in me even without knowing its source. He grew more attentive in a way that had lost whatever warmth it might once have carried and now read, plainly, as management, a man checking the load-bearing walls of a structure he intended to leave standing just long enough to finish extracting what he needed from it. He asked, twice, whether I was feeling all right, whether something was bothering me. I told him I was just tired. It was, by then, a lie I'd worn so long it barely registered as one anymore. On the second Wednesday of July, Eleanor had a follow-up appointment with her neurologist, and I drove her, as I had to nearly every appointment for over a year. In the waiting room, she reached over and gripped my hand again, the same deliberate pressure as before, and said, with more clarity than I'd heard from her since the stroke, "You found it." The papers. I looked at her, startled. "How did you know?" "Your face," she said simply. "Changed. Weeks ago." Even Eleanor, half paralyzed, relearning language one broken sentence at a time, had read what was happening in my house more clearly than I'd given myself credit for reading it myself. "What are you going to do?" she asked me, and there was no judgment in the question at all, only a kind of steady, waiting attention, the same attention she'd been offering me all spring in small gestures I hadn't fully understood until now. "I don't know yet," I told her honestly. "But I'm not going to let him decide when I find out." Eleanor nodded, satisfied in a way that suggested this was, in fact, the exact answer she'd been waiting to hear. "Good," she said. "My house. My trust. My choice too. Not just his." That night, driving home from the appointment with Eleanor dozing against the passenger window, I made a decision I'd been circling for weeks without letting myself land on it fully. I wasn't going to wait for Daniel to choose the moment. I wasn't going to let him control the timeline the way he'd controlled every other part of this. The notarization he'd hidden, the account he'd hidden, the woman he'd hidden, all of it timed around his own convenience, his own protection, his own exit strategy dressed up as patience. I would choose the moment myself. And I would choose it soon. I didn't know it yet, but the moment I chose wasn't going to arrive on the calm, controlled terms I was already imagining in the car that evening. It was going to arrive 3 days later, at a family dinner none of us had planned for what it became, and, by the time it was over, the version of myself who'd spent a month quietly gathering evidence and saying nothing would be gone for good. The dinner had been Eleanor's idea. In a roundabout way, she'd asked, the week before, whether Renee might come by on Sunday so the whole family could eat together for once, a phrase she managed clearly, without any of the hesitation the stroke usually put in her way. I understood, looking back, that Eleanor had engineered this. She wanted witnesses. She wanted her son's family in one room when whatever was coming finally came. I didn't tell anyone what I planned to do. I set the table the way I always did, Eleanor's plate positioned for her stronger hand, Maya's seat away from the draft of the sliding door, a candle I lit, and then, halfway through cooking, deliberately blew out again. Because some instinct told me this evening didn't need softening. Daniel came home at 6, unusually punctual, and kissed Eleanor's cheek, ruffled Maya's hair in a gesture she was slightly too old for and endured anyway, and asked me, lightly, what smelled so good. I told him roast chicken. He didn't notice, or chose not to notice, that I hadn't smiled when I said it. Renee arrived at 6:30 with a bottle of wine and an expression I recognized instantly, the careful, braced look of someone who suspected tonight might not stay ordinary. She caught my eye across the kitchen for half a second, and I gave her the smallest nod, and something in her posture straightened. We ate for the first 20 minutes the way families eat when everyone is performing normalcy for an audience of people they love and don't fully trust. Maya talked about her recital piece. Eleanor, slow and deliberate, asked Renee about her garden. Daniel refilled his wine twice and talked, with more energy than he'd shown at this table in months, about a contract his company had just landed, a large one, he said, the kind that would change things for the business next year. Change things. I set down my fork. Since we're talking about things changing, I said, and the table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses, before anyone has said anything specific, that the ordinary evening has ended. I found something a few weeks ago. I've been deciding what to do with it. I've decided. I had brought the folder to the table wrapped in a kitchen towel, tucked beside my chair where no one had noticed it. I set it down now, unwrapped it, and placed the contents in front of Daniel without raising my voice at all. The notarized divorce filing, the handwritten note about waiting on the trust, the printed bank statements. A printed screenshot of the message Maya had glimpsed, alongside a short typed timeline I'd built listing dates and amounts with the same clinical precision I brought to a patient's chart. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't ask a single question. I simply let the papers sit there, in the candlelight I deliberately not relit, and said, I think everyone at this table should see what I've been carrying alone for a month. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Daniel reached for the papers, scanned them fast, and I watched something in his face shudder closed, not shock, not guilt, but the particular recalibration of a man realizing the ground had already shifted beneath him before he'd noticed it moving. This is, you went through my things, he said, and his voice climbed immediately into something sharp and defensive. You've been spying on me. For a month. Do you understand how insane that is? You've been sitting on this, letting me think everything was fine, building some case against me, instead of just talking to me like an adult. He didn't deny a single fact on that table. He simply moved the conversation onto my behavior instead of his own, and for one unsteady second, standing at the edge of something I'd spent a month preparing for, I felt the old, familiar pull to apologize for exactly that, for finding out, for waiting, for not confronting him the moment I'd learned any of it. I didn't apologize. I stayed exactly where I was, hands flat on the table, and said, evenly, you had this notarized 7 weeks before you said a word to me. You wrote a note telling yourself to wait until your mother's money cleared. I think we can talk about my behavior after we've talked about that. Daniel's jaw tightened. He turned to Renee. Did you know about this? Is this why you've been so, he gestured, vaguely, at nothing, off with me all spring? Renee didn't flinch. I've known about Stacy since April, she said quietly. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure, and then I was sure, and I still didn't say anything fast enough. That's on me. But don't turn this into me. You did this. Renee, my silent ally for months without my fully understanding it, chose, in that moment, to become something louder. I hadn't expected it, even though some part of me had suspected for weeks that she would land, when it mattered, on my side of the table. Maya had gone very still, her fork frozen halfway to her plate, looking between her father and me with an expression I recognized from earlier that summer, the same careful, guarded look she'd worn the night she told me about the text message. "Dad," she said, quiet but clear enough that everyone heard it, "who's Stacy?" The question landed in the room like something physical. Daniel's face went through several expressions in quick succession: anger, then something closer to panic, then a flattened, controlled blankness he seemed to reach for deliberately, the way you reach for a coat in cold weather. "Maya, this isn't," he started. "You asked me if you were seeing someone," Maya said, still to me, not to him, her voice steady in a way that startled me. "I asked because of the text. I didn't want to be the one who said it out loud. But I think somebody should." A 15-year-old at her own dinner table said the sentence her father had spent 18 months avoiding. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply refused to let the silence hold any longer, and something about the plainness of it did more damage to whatever composure Daniel had left than anything I'd said. Daniel pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loud against the floor. I'm not doing this in front of Maya. This is a family dinner, not an interrogation." "You made it an interrogation the day you had this notarized," Renee said, gesturing at the papers still sitting in the center of the table, "and didn't tell a single person who actually deserved to know." Eleanor, who had been silent through all of it, her good hand resting flat on the tablecloth, spoke now, her words slower than usual, but landing with unmistakable weight. "Sit down, Danny." He didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the table, one hand braced on the back of his chair, breathing hard, and looked at his mother with an expression I'd never seen him wear before, something close to fear. "Mom, this doesn't concern you." "It concerns my house," Eleanor said. "My trust." "You asked Renee to help you sell it." Before I'd even decided, her eyes moved to me, then back to her son. "I decided already. Weeks ago. You don't know." Daniel's composure, whatever remained of it, seemed to genuinely crack for the first time that evening. "Know what?" "I changed it," Eleanor said. "After the stroke. Lawyer came. You get less. Claire and Maya get more. I didn't tell you because I wanted to see." She paused, gathering the next words with visible effort. "See who you'd be. Once you thought no one was watching." The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it that night. Daniel stood very still, staring at his mother, and something in his face, the anger, the deflection, the practiced defensiveness, seemed, for just a moment, to fall away entirely, leaving something rawer and younger looking underneath it. "You've been testing me," he said, quietly now, almost to himself. "This whole time." "No," Eleanor said. "I've been watching. There's a difference. You made your own choices, Danny. I just didn't tell you I was paying attention while you made them." I want to stop here for a moment. I had come to that table prepared for Daniel to deny everything, or to turn the accusations back on me, and he did both of those things, exactly as I'd expected. What I hadn't prepared for was watching his own mother be the one to finally take the ground out from under him, not with anger, but with a kind of patient, devastating clarity that made every argument he might have made afterward feel small. Daniel sat down heavily, the fight seeming to leave him all at once, his hands pressed flat against the table on either side of the folder he still hadn't fully looked away from. For a long moment, no one said anything. Maya had started crying quietly, not dramatically, just tears sliding down while she stared at her plate. Renee reached over and put a hand on her shoulder. "I don't know how to explain this in a way that makes it sound like anything other than what it is," Daniel finally said, his voice lower now, stripped of the defensiveness from a few minutes earlier. "So I'm not going to try to make it sound better than it was." He looked at me, really looked, for what felt like the first time in longer than I could easily measure, and began, haltingly at first and then with more steadiness, to say the thing I understood, even as he was saying it. That he'd needed to say for a very long time and had been actively avoiding since the moment it became true. "It started small," he said. "Stacy came on to run client relations about 1.5 years ago, right around when Mom had her stroke. Everything at home had gotten heavy. I'm not saying that to excuse anything, I'm saying it because it's true. I came into work every day exhausted, scared about Mom, watching you handle everything I should have been handling with you, and Stacy was just easy. She asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. That's it. That's how small it started. Someone asking a question and waiting. He wasn't looking at anyone else at the table now. Just at me. I told myself for months it was nothing. Coffee after work, then dinner once, then it kept happening, and I kept telling myself it was the last time. I never once told myself I was going to leave you for her. I told myself I was just surviving something hard, and this was how I was surviving it, and it didn't have to mean what it obviously meant. Even now, hearing him say it, I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, something more like recognition. I'd spent a month imagining what this confession would sound like, and some part of me had expected it to feel like vindication. It didn't. It felt like watching someone finally admit to a fire he'd been standing next to for over a year, insisting the whole time he couldn't smell the smoke. The divorce papers, he continued, and here his voice thinned slightly. I had those drawn up because I was scared. Scared of what it would cost me financially, with Mom's trust, with the business, if I did this the honest way, all at once, before things with her estate were settled. I told myself I was being practical. I know how that sounds, hearing it out loud. It sounds like exactly what it was, which is cowardice with a spreadsheet attached to it. He looked at Eleanor. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't thinking about the money, Mom. I was. I told myself I deserved to think about it because I was the one who'd get stuck holding everything if the timing went wrong. I didn't think about what it meant that I was planning around your money instead of talking to my own wife. This is the part one still find hardest to explain to people who ask me about that night. He wasn't performing remorse. I've seen that before in smaller forms over 16 years, Daniel apologizing in a way designed to close a conversation rather than open one. This was different. This was a man finally saying the true, unflattering version of events instead of the version that made him easier to live with. I don't have a version of this where I come out looking like someone who made one mistake, he said finally, quieter now, the anger completely gone from his voice. I made 100 small choices, every single one of them easier than the honest one, and I let them add up into something I'd have been ashamed to explain to Maya a year ago. I'm ashamed of it now. That doesn't undo any of it. I know that. No one said anything for a long moment. Maya wiped her face with the back of her hand. Renee's expression had softened slightly, though her hand hadn't left her niece's shoulder. Eleanor watched her son with an expression that held no triumph in it at all, only a kind of tired, complicated sorrow. I sat back in my chair, the folder still open on the table between us, and understood that whatever came next in this marriage would not be decided at this table, tonight, in front of everyone. Understanding that felt, for the first time in a month, like solid ground. I need you to leave tonight, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. Not forever, necessarily. I don't know what forever looks like yet. But not tonight. Not in this house. Daniel nodded slowly, and for once, he didn't argue. Daniel left that night with a duffel bag he packed in under 10 minutes, and the house, once his truck pulled out of the driveway, went quieter than it had been in over a year, not the strained, held-breath quiet of the past months, but something closer to the ordinary silence of a house settling after a long day. I stood in the kitchen for a while after everyone else had gone to bed, looking at the folder still sitting on the table, and felt, more than anything, tired in a way sleep alone wouldn't fix. The weeks that followed unfolded with a kind of practical momentum I hadn't expected. Renee, it turned out, had already quietly researched family law attorneys months earlier, just in case, and handed me a name the next morning without making a production of it. Eleanor's revised trust, once it became relevant to the divorce proceedings, meant Daniel had considerably less financial leverage than he'd planned around. The house in McCall stayed exactly where it was, untouched. And the business assets he'd hoped to shield behind timing were now subject to scrutiny he hadn't budgeted for. The hidden savings account, $43,000 by the time the accounts were formally disclosed, became part of the settlement rather than the private cushion he'd built it to be. I won't pretend the months that followed were simple. There were nights Maya cried for the family she'd had, not the one she was getting instead, and I held her through those without trying to talk her out of the grief, because some things don't need to be talked out of, only held. There was a strange, complicated period where Daniel and Stacy's relationship, freed from secrecy, seemed to buckle almost immediately under its own exposure. Whatever had sustained it in the shadows didn't survive being dragged into daylight. And by early autumn I heard, through Renee, that it had ended. I felt less satisfaction in that than I expected to. Mostly I felt the particular exhaustion of having been right about something I'd very much wished I was wrong about. Daniel, for his part, didn't disappear the way some part of me had braced for. He showed up, awkwardly at first, for Maya's recital, sitting 3 rows back, not presuming a seat beside me, and I found I could let him have that. He started, slowly, in the family counseling sessions Maya asked for, to speak more honestly about the year he'd spent choosing convenience over honesty, without the defensiveness that had characterized that dinner table confession. It didn't repair what had broken. Some things, once you've seen them clearly, can't be unseen back into their old shape. But it meant Maya got a father who was present and accountable, if not a marriage restored to what it had once pretended to be. Eleanor stayed with me through the rest of the year. That part, at least, hadn't been a lie or a strategy on anyone's part. She genuinely needed the care, and I genuinely wanted to give it. Once it was no longer tangled up with being told that care was the only value I held. Something between us had changed since that dinner table, deepened into something that felt, for the first time, mutual rather than assigned. She told me once, months later, haltingly but with full clarity, I picked you before he did. Long before. I didn't fully understand what she meant until I thought about it later, that in rewriting her trust, in watching quietly all spring, in gripping my wrist with everything her weakened hand could manage, she had been choosing me, deliberately, as someone worth protecting, long before I'd found the courage to protect myself. The divorce finalized the following spring, on terms considerably different from the ones Daniel had quietly notarized behind a stack of pillowcases. I kept the house. Maya's education was secured through Eleanor's trust regardless of anything that happened between her parents. I didn't get everything I might have fought for if I'd wanted a longer, uglier fight, and I found, when it was finished, that I didn't particularly want one. I wanted it over. I wanted to be a person again, rather than a role someone else had assigned me. There's a version of this story that ends with a dramatic exit, a slammed door, a clean and satisfying severance. That isn't quite what happened. What happened was quieter and, I think, more honest. A slow untangling, a series of ordinary Tuesdays in which I rebuilt, piece by piece, the parts of myself I'd folded away for the sake of holding a house together that had already, in the ways that mattered most, come apart. I still work at the clinic. I still love it, maybe more than I used to, because it's still the one place where the truth of a situation announces itself honestly, without hidden folders or handwritten notes about waiting for the right moment. Maya is doing well, better than I expected, given everything, in the particular resilient way teenagers sometimes surprise you. Eleanor and I still fold towels together on Thursday afternoons, though these days it feels less like a chore assigned to me and more like something I choose, freely, because I've come to love this difficult, sharp, generous woman who saw me clearly before I saw myself. I think about that dinner table often, not the confrontation itself, but the quiet after it, sitting alone in the kitchen with a folder full of proof I no longer needed to carry in secret. I think about how long I waited to open that closet door the first time, and what it cost me to wait, and what it finally gave me to stop. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house once the person you built it with is gone, and I don't mean the silence of loss, though there was plenty of that too. I mean the silence of a room finally telling you the truth about its own size. For over a year, I'd measured myself against a role someone else had written for me, and it was only once that role was gone that I understood how much of myself I'd folded away to fit inside it. The clearest mistake, looking back, wasn't that I stayed too long, or that I loved a man who eventually chose someone else. It's that I mistook my own competence for evidence of love. I was good at holding a household together, good at reading a stroke patient's needs before she could voice them, good at absorbing quiet cruelty and calling it patience, and somewhere along the way, I let being good at those things stand in for being valued for who I actually was underneath them. Daniel didn't invent that mistake in me. He simply found it, the way water finds the lowest point in a room, and settled there without ever asking whether the ground could hold his weight. What I've come to understand since is that competence and love are not the same currency, no matter how convincingly a marriage can make them feel interchangeable. A person can need you desperately and still not choose you, can rely on your steadiness every single day, and still be quietly planning a life that doesn't include you in it. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because it's the single most useful thing I learned from the entire year, and I wish someone had told me sooner, before I'd spent 16 years assuming otherwise. Renee's quiet loyalty taught me something too, that allies don't always announce themselves the way you expect. I spent months reading her careful phone calls as evasiveness, when in fact she was working, in her own cautious way, toward exactly the outcome that eventually protected me. Not everyone who loves you shows it the way you'd choose, in the moment you'd choose it. Sometimes you only recognize their loyalty in hindsight, once the shape of what they were protecting finally becomes clear. I could ask, easily, what would have happened if I'd opened that folder the very night I found it, walked straight into the living room, and confronted Daniel before I'd built my careful, methodical case. I don't know the answer, and I've stopped needing one. What I do know is that the month I spent gathering evidence instead of speaking immediately wasn't cowardice, exactly, even though it felt like cowardice at the time. It was a woman relearning, slowly and against every old instinct, that she was allowed to choose the moment of her own reckoning instead of simply absorbing whoever else's timeline was handed to her. If there's a single image I keep returning to from that year, it isn't the folder, or the bank statements, or even the dinner table where everything finally broke open. It's Eleanor's hand on my wrist, gripping harder than her weakened body should have allowed, trying to hand me a warning in 3 broken words before I was ready to hear it. I think about how much of the truth in our lives arrives that way, not in a single dramatic reveal, but in small, insistent gestures from people trying to tell us something before we're ready to listen. If you've ever measured your worth by how much you could carry for someone else, I hope you find, the way I finally did, that carrying isn't the same thing as being chosen, and that the difference between those two things is worth however long it takes you to see it clearly. If something in this story landed close to home for you, a moment you ignored, a person who let you know exactly what you were to them and expected you to accept it quietly, I'd love to hear it. Drop one word in the comments, the moment or the person that finally made you look. Thank you for sitting with this one with me. The most quietly devastating figure in this story is not Daniel, but Eleanor, a woman written off by her own family as diminished, and who turned out to be the only person seeing the entire situation with complete clarity. Her stroke stripped her of easy speech, but not of judgment, and it's worth sitting with the irony. The person everyone assumed needed the most care was, in fact, the one doing the most careful watching. The one quietly redirecting the outcome months before anyone else understood there was anything to redirect. Claire's arc isn't really about catching Daniel. It's about the slow, costly process of learning that gathering proof and taking action are 2 different kinds of courage, and that she'd only ever practiced the first one. Her instinct to put the folder back exactly where she found it twice, with 2 separate pieces of evidence, reveals a woman who had spent years mistaking information for power, when the 2 only become the same thing once you're willing to act on what you know. That gap between knowing and acting is where most of her suffering that year actually lived, not in the discovery itself. Daniel's confession is the story's most complicating piece, precisely because it refuses to flatten him into a villain with no interior life. He wasn't chasing cruelty. He was chasing the path of least resistance, one small avoidance at a time, until the accumulated avoidances became indistinguishable from betrayal. That's arguably more unsettling than if he'd been simply cold or calculating from the start. It suggests infidelity and abandonment don't always require a villain, sometimes just a long enough chain of a person choosing comfort over honesty. What ultimately separates Claire from Daniel isn't that she made no mistakes, she did, and the story doesn't let her off easily for the month she spent silent. It's that once she moved with the whole truth in hand, on her own timeline, rather than someone else's. That, more than the settlement or the confrontation itself, is what she actually walked away with. What stays with me most from Claire's story is how ordinary the erosion was. No single day broke that marriage. It was folded laundry, unopened questions, 100 small moments where speaking up felt like too much and staying quiet felt like patience. I think most of us have a version of that closet door we walked past without opening, not because we didn't sense something, but because some part of us understood exactly how much opening it would cost. Maybe the real question isn't whether you'd have found the folder sooner than Claire did. It's whether you'd have believed yourself the first time your body told you something was wrong, instead of the 11th. If there's a moment from your own life this story brushed up against, a warning you talked yourself out of, or a person who finally told you, plainly, what you were to them, I'd genuinely like to know. Drop it in the comments, one word or one sentence, whatever feels true. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through.